and stepped up to support and help them in many areas of their lives. We are part of the International Men's Day, which is a global organization. The IMD follows 6 pillars overall for the well-being of boys and men. It has been serving for over 21 years, and nearly 90 countries around the world has acknowledged the International Men's Day, and they've joined together and they're doing various activities regularly. So today we have a very important topic that's dear to my heart. And the title for today's session is Eliminating Violence Against Boys and Men. And so we are looking for this panel discussion to come with solutions because I'm sure we can all agree that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. And so let's not just stare at a problem, let's come with solutions so we can eliminate. In supporting the International Day for the elimination of violence against men and boys on this 31st day of January. And this year is the second observance. We have a diverse panel, and you're about to hear the diversity if I accidentally botch their name. Bless God. So forgive me in advance. We have David Benatar, and he is a professor of philosophy from Cape Town, South Africa. And he says here he's joining through by phone. We have Elise Ferran, and she is a Dr. DeKent from Finland. We have Andrew Smiler, he's a PhD author, co-founder of the Healthy Masculinity Initiative, and I'm sure he'll be able to tell us more about that. And he's from the United States. And we have Juho Martinari, who is a peace activist out of Finland. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining and willing to be a part of this panel discussion. Just take our time right now. Everybody just put your hands together for the panel discussion. We're here in a Zoom room right now, and just imagine hearing the applause right now coming from all over the world for this panel discussion. Let's start with a brief introduction, and we will go to the questions. So I have a list of questions before me here. And the first question: has violence among men and boys increased during the past decades? If so, why? And I imagine, Sivam, we are going to call the names of, or each person will go to a question, go to answer the question.
You can pick from your screen.
All right. So let me go with Juho first, the question.
Sure. Thank you, powerful Steve, and many thanks to Voice of Man 360 for hosting this panel discussion. It's a great honor to be in this panel with such a qualified speakers. I tried to think about this question beforehand. Has violence increased during past decade? That was the question, right? Against men and boys. So obviously, I'm not the best person to answer this from the point of view of like statistics, but we know that men and boys suffer from violence during conflicts, and often the men who suffer in wars, they are also really young. And one recent example that comes to my mind is the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh last year, and that was like a realization for me about how young these people are who suffer in these conflicts, and there were, I think, thousands of men and young men died in this conflict like just half a year ago. And what I know about these victims, many of them were born in after the year 2000. So they were like really young, and as someone who was born in the 90s, I consider myself to be young still, but they were like much younger than me. So it was a realization. And yeah, this is my answer.
Thank you very much, Juho. Thank you. I'm just going to go now to the second person. Smiler, same question. Has violence among men and boys increased during the past decades? And if so, why?
I think that's a great question, and it's got a complicated answer, as do most questions about boys and men. I just put a link in that chat box if folks want to click on that. And I'm going to state what I know best, which is the US. Not for lack of interest in other countries, but this is where I live, this is where I work, this is the culture I understand the best. If we look at reports of homicide, murder in various ways, in the US, what we see is rates that were relatively high through the 1990s and the beginning of 2000s. And for those of you that are familiar with US history, the early 1990s included the crack epidemic. It included some relatively high rates of unemployment. And that started to come down through the late 90s and the early 2000s. And then when we hit the Great Recession at the end of the first decade of the 2000s, we see those rates go back up. We get to the early 2010s, the second term of the Obama administration. The Great Recession is over. The economy has shifted. It starts to come back. And we see more job creation, job growth. People's standards of living start to increase again in the US, and the crime rate goes down. And I think there's a very clear connection between those kinds of parameters, what's going on with the economy, sense of hopelessness or sense of ability to get money that in particular men have, because we know that men commit the vast majority of violent crimes in the US, and the violent crime rate. And I think that's a pretty straightforward connection for me, although there's certainly lots of pieces in there. The economy is complex, motives for crime are complex, but I think those two are pretty clearly linked. And I'll leave it to other folks to say other things.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Andrew. And we go to our other panelists, our only female on the panel, Elise. Same question.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks for having me. I think this is indeed a very complicated question to answer, because we're talking about lots of different types of violence. You know, when we say violence against men and boys, I mean, and as exemplified with the two former panelists who mentioned very different types of violence there. And there are many ways, many types of violence. I think what is quite clear is that the violence against men has certainly attracted more attention over the past decades than it had before. I mean, we talk about this a lot more than we used to. And especially we talk a lot more about types of violence which were hidden, especially sexual violence against men in particular, which is something which used to be completely silenced and not talked about, and also domestic violence, for instance, against men, which is a topic which is now more talked about and used not to be. There is a tradition in the academia not to talk about the other types of violence that men are victim of, and not to talk about the types of discriminations they are victim of. For instance, to consider that military conscription is normal, and it's normal that more men die in war. We know that around 90% of casualties in war, for instance, are men. But we treat this as normal. We treat this as something that is not worth talking about. But I think that there are also, if we try to understand why we don't speak about violence against men, we also have to understand that it's men themselves who don't want to talk about it. You know, there is an issue of pride, there is an issue of masculinity, you know, not to want to be perceived as weak, and therefore we don't speak about the violence we have been victim of. We have stories of, you know, coming out of violence or getting stronger because of violence, but we don't so much put the stress on you know, what we've been through. So there is, I think in general, there is an under-reporting problem with violence against men. And the fact that we pay more attention to it probably will lead to an even better reporting in the future. But we are not there yet, in my view. But it's difficult, as I said, to measure exactly, to have precise ways to measure it.
Wonderful answers, Elise, and I thank you for even mentioning, you know, war and also sexual violence and so forth, because it kind of leads me to bring this up as a side question to the first question about suicide. Is suicide then recognized as violence towards men as well? The fact that you mentioned war, and then you have PTSD, post-traumatic stress. Can all three of you, Juho, can we go back to that and what your understanding of should there be a recognition of suicide as violence towards men as well?
Yeah, I think we could talk about suicide as violence against men. I think often when we talk about suicide, we tend not to draw so much attention to the gender dimension of this issue. But when we look at the gender, we can see that this is something that men suffer, and like I know many young men who took their own lives already at this age, and sure, for like in some way the society has failed every time when someone ends up doing such an act, and we should talk about the gender dimension more.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. What do you have to say on the issue, Andrew?
I'm going to join the chorus here. I think we should absolutely talk about suicide as violence against men. Certainly my own training in mental health, we talked about suicide as violence against the self. And certainly if the self is male, that fits. We know there are a lot of similarities in the dynamics when we look at homicide and suicide. And it certainly makes sense to me to talk about suicide as violence against male suicide as violence against men.
Thank you very much. And Elise, you have the last word on this?
Yeah, thank you, powerful Steve. Yes, I agree. It's certainly a very interesting type of violence against men to consider. And it's especially interesting if you look at how the rates of suicide, of male suicide, evolve and what triggers it. And we can see that especially now, it's a big issue with, you know, the economic crisis because of the pandemic. And also we see very high rates of suicide among young males in post-conflict societies because very often there are crises and difficulties in let's say, embodying, you know, some types of masculinity, and many young men who fail to, you know, embody, enact those models, if you want, commit suicide because of these reasons. And so you see that there are an array of reasons leading to male suicide, which is very much related, and I expect this is something that we will come back to during the discussion with other questions. It's related to the types of expectations that are put on men in terms of what type of masculinity they should perform. And therefore, when the context, the political or economic or cultural context is very hard, then the rates of suicide go up as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I do have some statistics, as you were mentioning, Elise, even this, the world crisis, called the pandemic, has hit. I've come to learn that the suicide rate has gone up 4 times from 2019, let's say, because the pandemic started in 2020. And among those numbers, 3 in every 4 people that commit suicide is a male figure. So definitely that is a crisis. Thank you all very much for your comprehensive answers to the first question. Coming to the second question, what effective strategies can be implemented to eliminate violence among boys? And when I think about violence among boys, 2 things come to mind. One, bullying in school. And in the communities where I'm from, there's a lot of gang affiliations and so forth. There are females that are a part of gangs, but predominantly it is a boy and man thing. So what effective strategies can be implemented to eliminate violence among boys? And I'd like to start with Andrew first on this question.
So sorry, Steve.
Yes.
Did you catch up with David Benatar?
Oh.
Yeah, you missed that.
Is David among the? Oh, there's David way down there. My apologies. I didn't see him on the screen here. Yes, David, can we go to the first question for you, please? Would you like me to repeat it, or you're okay?
No, thank you. I'm okay. So
Okay.
I'd like to note that is an empirical question, but there are some conceptual issues embedded in it. So the way you formulated the question, you said, has violence among men and boys increased in recent decades? And if so, why? So you said among men and boys, and that's different, obviously, from violence to men and boys. Although, as some of the other panelists have indicated, most violence inflicted on men and boys is inflicted by men and boys. Not all of it is. And so you framed the question, I think, in a slightly narrower way from the way that we should frame it. We should look at the broader issue.
Understand.
You've also suggested about recent decades, and I think one thing that Andrew's data shows is that there can be fluctuations. So if you ask in recent decades, that's different from asking in recent centuries or recent millennia. If you look over longer periods of time, you may get different answers to the question than if you look over shorter periods of time. There is evidence that violence in general has reduced per capita since thousands of years ago, that we have less chance now of being the victim of violence than we did at much earlier stages in human history. That's a general empirical claim, and would presumably also be true of males. But one way of looking at it is per capita. The other way is looking at it in terms of the sheer amount. And given that there are just so many more people now, there's going to be so much more violence. So that's just a few points, I think, by way of clarification with respect to your first question. You also asked something about suicide. And what I'd like to note there is that suicide can be brought about both by violent and by non-violent means. Not all instances of suicide are violent deaths, just as all deaths in general are not violent. So I would say that suicide is a problem in general, and it has a gendered component to it. And so I would be interested in the violent instances of suicide, but I wouldn't only be interested in those. I would be interested in the non-violent forms that result from any cause, but in this context, the ones that Elise, for example, was referring to.
Awesome. It's interesting that you pointed that out. Thank you very much, because I never saw it from that perspective of violent versus non-violent. In my mind, I just think of, suicide as such, and the suffering that happens, the family, the fallout from the family for when one takes one's life. But thank you very much for educating me on that. So now we come to the second question, and since I left David out, I'm gonna come to the second question and allow David to start this. And so the question reads, what effective strategies can be implemented to eliminate violence among boys?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best person to go first on this one, because this is a kind of policy question or a practical question. It's not that philosophers have nothing to say about these sorts of questions, but I suppose I'd start off with a somewhat skeptical note. And that what I would say is I'm not sure that we can just produce a kind of formulaic strategy that's going to work. My suggestion is that we're actually going to have to try lots of things in a kind of piecemeal way in order to reduce the levels of violence against men and boys. You use the word eliminate. Eliminate suggests you can get rid of it entirely. We haven't succeeded in eliminating any evils like murder or theft in the world, or rape. We haven't succeeded in eliminating all of those. And I don't think that we could ever do that. That's to set the bar too high. But certainly what we should do is constantly be struggling to get closer to an ideal, and the ideal would be the complete elimination.
Right.
I think the first thing is we've got to be aware of the problem. Elise has mentioned that there's more awareness now. I would probably put a qualification on that. I would say there's more awareness in some circles. My sense is that there's also a lot of denial about this, and also a lot of hostility to people who have not forgotten this issue and who are aware of this issue. I've certainly been on the receiving end of lots of hostility, a lot of people who want to silence this kind of view. And so I think the very first step is to acknowledge the problem. If you acknowledge the problem, now you need to start addressing it. One way, of course, is to recognize these gender roles, to try to undermine them in various ways, just as that is being done to a greater extent for females. It should now also be done for males. Gender roles affect both sexes negatively, and there are also benefits for both sex, but they're unfair. And so we ought to be trying to address that. It's been addressed more readily and more successfully, I believe, so far for females, at least in some parts of the world. And I think we should be doing something similar for males. There's obviously more to say, but I realize there are many others who'd like to answer that question as well.
Thank you very much, David, also for your consideration as well. Andrew, so second, you're the second person to answer this question.
Thank you. This is a great question and a great discussion thus far, and I hope to keep it going in that vein. And I'm going to echo some things that David just said. I'm also going to pull in some things that Elise and my Finnish colleague, whose name I don't want to try to pronounce, have said. And I'm going to highlight, and again, I'm going to give you US stats because this is where I live and work, and those are the numbers I know the best. In the US, the violence statistics typically show us that about 90% of violent crimes are perpetrated by males, and males are about 75% of the victims. And in the US, we talk a lot about violence, but we don't typically gender it. It's just violence, it's crime. We don't typically say male on male violence, even though the stats tell us that's exactly what it is. We also invest a lot in crime prevention. And when we talk about crime prevention here in the US, we mostly talk about quote unquote security that makes it harder to commit crimes. We don't really talk about eliminating the reasons why people might choose to commit a crime. So, okay, if we get into that knowledge base, which is not nearly as big as other knowledge bases, we see that there's a couple of particularly common reasons for why boys and men commit crimes. And again, most of these statistics are based on adults 18 and up and not so much children or minors. We know that jealousy is a big reason why men commit crimes. Fear of losing a partner or having lost a partner, and vengeance drives a lot of assault cases, whether that's male on male, in a typical heterosexual dyad, the two men kind of fighting over a woman, or whether that's male gaining vengeance on his former partner. We also know that a lot of violence is around efforts to get money. This might be so-called petty crimes, simple burglary or muggings, but it also might be much bigger than that, larger schemes. We talk about some of these Wall Street types who have, defrauded people out of millions and millions of dollars. Again, it's an effort to get money. The only thing different there is the scale. We also see crimes that are about defending one's turf. And again, that might be, those are crimes of protection, if you will, especially if we think about gang violence, or the mafia, which is a different form of gang. We hear about those kinds of violent groups defending their territory against other groups. So we have these three as very common reasons for why younger boys get into fights, why adult males commit crimes, including homicide. And I'm going to sidestep for a second. My thinking is often influenced by the work of anthropologist David Gilmour, who published a book called Manhood in the Making back in 1990. Gilmour is an anthropologist. He studied adulthood rights, the rituals around what it means to become a man in a range of societies. And he talked about three common reasons, three things that tend to be highlighted in these manhood rights, these adulthood rights. They were providing, protecting, and procreating. And our most common reasons for crime here map directly on these. We have a lot of crimes related to making money, having enough to pay your bills, if you will, providing. We have a lot of crimes about protecting either one's partner or oneself, and a lot of crimes related to procreating, which I labeled as jealousy and crimes of passion. And again, considering some of the data and what I was mentioning earlier about the connections between how the economy is doing at a national level and homicide rates, again, we start to see some of the connections here. So I think one way, certainly not the only way, this is a very complex issue, but one way that we might really start to begin to reduce violence is to really pay attention to the economy and the impact of not being able to get a good job or a good enough job. We certainly know that very high levels of unemployment help tip the balance towards war. Again, and there's a whole complex political dynamic to that. But I think paying attention to these issues helps us understand why many boys and men might choose to be violent and what we might do to prevent some of that violence. And I'm going to stop there.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. Much appreciated. Elise, same question.
Yes, I think I would like to start by following up on what Andrew just mentioned, namely the fact that when we think about violence against boys or against men in general, we tend to, what we see are punitive policies. So we see policies in order to fight, to condemn, in order to jail, in order to punish the authors of those violence. And I think that what is needed is a preventive approach. We don't really think, we don't really think about what leads people to actually commit those acts. And we have this very restrictive and punitive mindset when it comes to violence. And I think history has proven that it's actually not necessarily the right way to go. So I think that, of course, what is needed is promoting, positive masculinity models. That is perhaps where it's, really important, but also promoting awareness on the issue. And I would really, not so much in the, among the general public, well, it's needed, but I think in terms of, raising awareness among those who are in contact with children in particular. So, of course, the relatives, the families, but also the school staff, the social staff, because something that we see again and again, well, my specialty is more in conflict areas, but I think that applies more generally, that we see that the medical, social, educational staff are not trained to recognize the signs before it happens and even after it happens sometimes. So there is also a need for training, the accompanying staff, and this is not done. I would also, my opinion is also that it's not so much national or international policies that we need, but more like local initiatives, because many of these issues are related to local problems, to local stakes. So we spoke about earlier we spoke about the influence of the economic context, but there are also specific, neighborhoods where, there are specific issues that lead to violence. And I think that would be important to put the stress on those local initiatives and local support groups as well, which is, some of those groups exist, but they are very often underfunded, not recognized by the authorities, and even though they do a wonderful job. So I think this is the types of things that we should try to implement.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Elise. Juho, same question.
Yeah, so many great points have been said. So I will return to what Powerful Steve said in the beginning about education. I think we need to turn our attention to the education system for the preventive action. And I know that in Finland there is a trend where we see that boys are falling behind girls in their educational success. So I think these all add to the problem of violence as well. So I think we need to address these issues first. Also, what I think would help as a strategy would be to make sure that all boys would have a possibility to have a hobby, like to do something in their spare time. I say this because when I was a teenager, like 10, 15 years ago, the environment where I was, it was quite violent. Like it was not a gang, but it was something like that. So violence was part of like the everyday in my youth. And what I remember from these times, like all of us there, we didn't have any hobbies. Like we didn't play in a football team or ice hockey team or anything like that. So during our spare time, we used alcohol. So I think we also need to highlight how alcohol and other drugs are connected to violence as well. We need to make sure that everybody has hobby. And why I didn't have hobby, it was related to socio-economical background. So even in Finland, it's quite expensive to join an ice hockey team, for example. So we need to look at. So I agree with the previous speakers. We need to look at the socio-economical aspect as well. I would also return to what Mr. Benatar said. We need to better acknowledge these issues. I don't think we acknowledge them quite enough. And for this problem, I think the day that is now being that was instituted last year, this International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Men and Boys. I think these kind of initiatives are needed to raise awareness of violence among boys.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm really glad that you brought up the component of extracurricular activities and hobbies, because I can actually speak from my personal experience on this matter, growing up in the Brampton area, which is right next door to Toronto. We're just 20 minutes west of Toronto, and among our schools, we had rivals, and you form your friend base became your gang per se. It's not that we had a gang name or anything like that, but your friend base became that, and we would go to other schools to try to look for girlfriends and stuff like that, and then the other boys from that school, they didn't take a liking of that, and so the fights will break out for that mere reasons that you're going to another school. And so there were rivals and things like that. But I don't know if you all know, the inception of breakdancing actually came out of the gangs of New York, where they decided to have battles with dancing rather with guns and knives. And so hence, spinning on your head and doing your pop, tick, and wave and stuff like that, it became a way of giving an outlet of your anger and rage and so forth. And so we here in Brampton, we actually started a little break crew, and we started to go from school to school and to challenge the other boys in breakdance competitions. So I can really contest to what you had to say to that portion of my life. I live that, and it also channeled a lot of my frustration and anger and so forth. So I thank you all for that question. And so the question 3, and I'm going to start with Elise on that, which kind of springboards from question 2. How can these strategies be properly assessed and monitored? And you mentioned that it should be from a community perspective. And, you know, we live here in Canada, and we have 3 levels of government in Canada. So the perspective in which you're talking from, Elise, from a Canada perspective, is I'm sorry, the word just slipped me in a moment. We have the federal government, we have the provincial government, and we have the local government. So how can these strategies be properly assessed and monitored, Elise?
Yeah, thank you for the question, powerful Steve. Well, I think that really we need to have assessment strategies that take the local context into account, because what we call success depends on the community we are talking about, because not just because everybody starts from a different place, but also because success is recognized in different ways in different communities. You know, the way we assess, you know, whether a young boy has succeeded will vary depending on the family background, on the religious background, and so on. You know, there are many ways to measure success. So I think that would be the first point. And I think that, you know, blanket policies over whole countries are usually not good, and also not properly assessed, precisely because they are too general. As for you know, how to assess and monitor, I think that we can think about a lot of quantitative as well as qualitative indicators. And I'm sure my colleagues, I'm sure Andrew in particular will have a lot to say about this. He's not sure apparently, but but I think in terms, for instance, of lowering the statistics of crime, for instance, that would be a pretty obvious indicator. Although, as I said, we have to be careful of generalizations, because they tend to, you know, hide and veil potential differences across communities and across localities. But I think that perhaps the most interesting indicators would be qualitative, to think, for instance, about what kind of positive images, you know, are developed. Also, Juho mentioned hobbies and activities beyond school, for instance, seeing how many clubs, sports clubs or theater clubs or music clubs or dance clubs, for instance, are developed. I think those kinds of, I would trust those indicators maybe more, you know, than indicators that would be elaborated at a national level on, you know, the overall happiness of men, for instance. But I'm sure others will have much better, you know, answers than mine.
Awesome. David, you're second.
Thank you. I'm not sure how much I have to add, because if you recall, I had somewhat of a skeptical answer to the second question. I'm not sure that they're sort of straightforward strategies. I think we need to piecemeal identify where problems are, but also look at the underlying problem and try and address that. But just so myriad ways. In other words, there's no one thing that you can do, or even 5 things that you can do to undermine a gender stereotype. This is something that happens in the home, it happens in the school, it happens in the broader society. It's not that you can flip a switch and it changes any one of those places. So I'm sort of skeptical about thinking there's a formulaic solution to something of this kind. I'm not suggesting that the other speakers are saying that there is. I'm just wanting to highlight what I take to be the difficulty here. With respect to the assessment and monitoring, again, you can assess whether new pastimes and hobbies have been introduced and those sort of facilities, but that's different from assessing whether it's had the requisite impact. And when you see a reduction in violence, whether that is attributable to the particular intervention that you've made. I mean, presumably you're not going to be doing any one intervention by itself at one time. You're going to try multiple things. And then in the real world, you're going to have confounding factors. You're going to know what has caused this change, if anything. So there are lots of complexities there. I think this is an area for social scientists to do their work. I'm not a social scientist rather than a philosopher, and so I should leave the bulk of this question to others.
Thank you very much for that, David. Juho, you're next.
Sure. So I'm not sure if I have anything clever to add to this discussion, but I think what Elise said about qualitative methods to assess, it would be fine. But I would also say that we need to pay more attention to this quantitative data that we have about crimes and the victims of violence. And for example, in Finland, there is this crime victim surveys. They are done like each year to see, like, to ask people like how did they experience crime and violence. And I think these are better tools to see the situation with violence, for example, better than, for example, official crime statistics, because the reality doesn't show up in these official statistics. Oftentimes the violence among boys or men, it's not reported anywhere. So you just carry it inside you and that's it. So I think such service would be good. Yeah, that's it.
All right. Andrew, how do you think strategies can be properly assessed and monitored?
I think that's a great question, and we should do 16 weeks and we'll have a course about how to do that. As other folks have mentioned, you know, this is a very complicated issue. You know, David mentioned that, and Elise also pointed to the need for local data. I think indicators like homicide rates, which I've been pointing to, or the economy, you know, those are huge national statistics, and especially living here in the US, that is truly huge. We're one of the largest countries on the planet. Right. I think effectiveness, documenting effectiveness and demonstrating effectiveness and doing that kind of assessment is really related to local initiatives and local programming, including, as Juho was mentioning, activities for boys and men outside of the educational system. And I also add, and then this comes from the folks who are big in the positive psychology movement, at least in the US, but I think in the West, and I don't know much about the East or the global South here, we have tended to focus on kind of the negatives to the exclusion of the positives. Right? I can tell you, I can find and give you lots of statistics about what's going wrong in the US, but I can't tell you how many people or how many men are well-adjusted or how many are happy. And I think without that information, it makes it really difficult to know what's going well. You know, I suspect that most people who are well-adjusted and happy probably aren't committing murder. Although I've met and worked with some folks who qualify as psychopaths, and they are clearly the exception to that rule. But I think for most of us, you know, doing reasonably well in our context, our local context, fitting in to our family, our community, even at the regional and national level, you know, that's how we do well. And we don't have good ways to track and measure and assess that, or to know if we're talking about a boy, and Juho gave an example from his own life, you know, how's a boy growing up in the context where Juho grew up in kind of shift paths and end up as respectable and kind of good citizen, as opposed to ending up in a place where he is perhaps in jail, which sounded like it may not have been too far away had he made some slightly different decisions.
Okay, thank you very much. If I could just continue on this vein for a minute and play a little bit of advocacy and say that I believe that if the government will fund, and I heard you who mentioned specifically hockey. So let me just let's just focus on hockey. Let's be directive for a moment here. I believe that if the government will throw funding into hockey, that every child, whether it be male or female, wants to get involved in hockey to the age of, let's say, 13, that the government will fund it. And what would be your opinion if that would increase or decrease violence if the government will just fund? Because you mentioned the cost factor, and so many people, many young children might not be able to participate in such an extracurricular activity because they can't afford it. But if it was government funding, do you feel that this will decrease violence among boys? And I'll start with you first, Juho, then I'll go to Andrew second.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm sure it will decrease violence among boys. I think that's clear. I'm not sure if all violence among boys happens because they can't afford hobbies. So probably that would not like eliminate the violence altogether, but I'm sure it will decrease it. And also, I think government funding for this would be not enough. There should also be support measures for the parents that they can support children in their
transportation as such. Transportation as such.
Yeah, exactly. That was a problem for me as well. There was a huge distance to do anything. Distances in Finland, they are quite long. So, but yeah.
Awesome. Andrew?
I'm gonna go with a somewhat similar answer. I think it couldn't hurt. I'm not sure that it would be much help, especially if we're just if the regional or national government is just supporting one type of program. And I'll stay with sports because that was your example, Steve.
Right.
I was just reading a segment in a book by Andrew Reiner called Better Boys, Better Men. And he devotes a chapter to the culture of sports in the US. And one of the things he points out is that there are a number of athletic coaches at the middle school and high school levels, kind of folks working with boys aged 10 to about 18, who are really good and caring and compassionate, and they want to help the boys they work with become better people, become better men. But then there's also a segment of that population of coaches who, even though they talk about their boys as their family and they talk about team as family, for lack of a better word, they really treat some of their players like crap. And they push the boys until they break, and it's all about winning. And if a boy has a bad game or makes a bad play, the coach might not talk to him for the rest of that game or the next day. These are not behaviors we would tolerate or we would want to see in a family. But given the culture around sports here in the US, that is often a culture we tolerate. And we praise some of those coaches. We certainly hear about US coaches at all levels who, if they win, we like that their methods are extreme, and we accept that because they're winning, and that's the thing that is most important to us. So while I think kind of at the macro level, greater government funding for non-school activities would be helpful, I think, again, like we need to go back to the local level and really know what those mentors are communicating to the boys and how they're treating them. Otherwise, we are just replicating the problems that already exist.
Right. The word that I was looking for before was municipal. That was the word that slipped me. when we talk about the local government. So Elise, do you feel that if on a municipal level, a great amount of funding will go towards subsidizing, so the government is paying for extracurricular activities, do you feel that that will be significant enough to decrease violence among boys?
No, I would tend to be on the skeptical side. I think it would be part of a bunch of measures that might be effective, but I'm a bit uncomfortable with how we've been discussing this, because we've been discussing this as if violence against men was spread out across all groups in a similar way. It's not true. I mean, there are some groups in which violence is, there are higher rates of violence. And so that means that violence is not just something to happen, in a vacuum. It is something that depends on socioeconomic disparities, for instance, in more disadvantaged neighborhoods, for instance, or families. And so just providing sporting opportunities to kids, won't change the rest, of the equation. And we know that because I don't know, I mean, I come from France, and in France, there were many of those programs, targeting disadvantaged neighborhoods, which were also neighborhoods inhabiting a lot of people from migrant origin. And they were, creating and all these sports, building these sports facilities and sports club and so on and so forth. And it didn't have any visible result. Why? Because the families and the kids living in those neighborhoods were also facing discrimination, racism, difficulty to access jobs, and so on and so forth. So, okay, it can't hurt, to help at the sports level, but it will not be enough, because the violence is a result of multiple causality or complex causality, as we say in social sciences. So, so I think it has to be, and that's why I'm saying it has to be done at the local level, trying to really understand the local circumstances and try to design a program which is really targeting the specific vulnerabilities, at the local level.
Thank you very much for that, Elise. Just reading something here that Andrew had put in, directive to Savan and the Voice of Men. I think the discussion of schooling and boys' disadvantage in those spaces is both important and complex, and perhaps Voice of Men 360 could facilitate a discussion on that in the next few months. So just bear in mind of that, Savan. It seems like we have different compartments being broken up here. The question 4, and I would start this one with Elise. I believe, I think it's you to start the questions next. Do governments in the developed countries and global South seriously deal with violence against men? So what value has the government placed on this initiative?
Again, I think it depends very much on the type of violence you're talking about. For instance, if you talk about pedophilia, for instance, this is something that is increasingly, tackled and increasingly talked about, and I think, at least. But other types of violence that that men are victims of are really not talked about. So we were talking about sexual violence earlier on. There was a study conducted a few years ago, which has established that only 63 countries out of 189 penalized rape against men and recognized that 63 countries out of 189 only recognized female victims of rape, and those 63 countries represent 2/3 of the world population. So it means that in 2/3 of the world, so to say, if you are a man victim of rape, you are not recognized. And worse, in some countries, you can go to jail if you complain. If you say I have been victim of rape, then you can go to jail because you can be accused of being homosexual. That's the case in Uganda, for instance. So, so I think that, it's very different depending on the type of violence we are talking about. And I think that the states also don't have interest in speaking about all types of violence men are victim of. And I'm thinking here about, the fact that nationalism, conscription of males, for instance, and the fact that we're sending males to fight is something that states don't have interest in, foregrounding, because this is, it's part of how nations are built. Nations are built on certain notions of masculinity that entail violence against men. And so those types of violence are not types of violence that countries will boast about, saying, oh, see, how we are training all those men to go to their death, or to go and kill other men. And so I think that this is, it really depends on the type of violence we are talking about. And it's not necessarily a distinction between developed countries and the global south, for instance. It's a lot more complex than that, in my view.
Thank you very much for that, Elise. Juho, I'll go to you next. Do governments in the developed countries and global South seriously deal with violence against men?
So I will just say that I'm not too familiar with the situation in the global South and developed countries to say to add anything to what was said before. I will just say that some issues like Elise just mentioned are not only between different parts of the world. They might be universal, such as male conscription. It's also in Finland, which promotes itself as like a utopia of gender equality. However, we have a male conscription here. So I think this is an issue that's probably quite universal. As a peace activist, I would want to make sure that all conscientious objectors, like people who refuse to join the military, that their rights would be respected. But that's all.
Thank you very much, Juho. Andrew, a question to you.
Again, I don't know nearly as much about developing countries in the global South as I do about the US. And again, I'll echo Elise's comments that we need to be clear about different types of violence. But I know from to the extent that I follow what the US government does with its international aid and those various programs, those programs have very much been about addressing violence against women, mirroring our national policy here, where we don't really talk about violence against men. We just talk about it as crime, but we don't have that gendered component, even though males are 75% of the victims of violent crime. So I would suspect that elsewhere around the globe, it is not really addressed as violence against men. It's just violence, which countries may or may not particularly prioritize, depending on, again, their local issues and priorities.
Mm-hmm. David, do you have anything to home in on this question?
Not really. I think the answer is no. Any intention that's being given is insufficient. One point I would make is that some of the answers that are being given to this question actually have some bearing on the earlier questions. And I think what they show is that it's not just a matter of local. I think the local is important, and often you need to work locally and deal with that, but there are broader societal problems that feed into the local problems. And one of those is the whole idea of what a gender role is. If you have conscription for males only, or you have legislation, let's say, that allows the corporal punishment of males but not of females, that's something at a national level which is setting a certain tone, which can have ramifications lower down.
Interesting. A thought just came to my mind pertaining to, we talked a little bit about sports and government and so forth. And I know right now, the UFC, the ultimate fighting, we're talking about hand-to-hand combat with very small gloves. And I've even seen that there are bare knuckles and things like that. Can certain organized sports, could it be more detrimental to bringing or promoting violence towards men versus, and mind you, the UFC started out as just men against men, and now the women are taking stage in that as well. Let me ask you first, David, do you think that sports as UFC, those heavy physical contact sports, promote violence against?
So I think this does tie in with the point that Andrew was making earlier, that sports are not by themselves a solution, and in fact could in some circumstances be part of the problem. I don't know enough about this particular sport that you're speaking about, but certainly there are violent sports, and we may have concerns about those. And they may go beyond gender concerns. There may be a gendered aspect to them, but even if you had equal participation of females in those kinds of sports, there might be something to worry about. So for example, we know about head injuries in American football, and their neck injuries in the sport of rugby. Now, insofar as you're encouraging children to take up these sports and to engage in these sports, and insofar as you're adulating people who are outstanding in these sports, you may be doing something that's actually proposing a kind of health problem to individuals and more broadly. So I mean, I've personally got great concerns about violent sports. I don't want to be too prescriptive to competent people who want to decide that they want to engage in that. But often this starts much earlier on. Often this starts with children. And then there are all kinds of pressures that might be brought to bear on them that I think would be inappropriate and worrisome.
Elise, what do you think? Do you think violent sports is more part of the problem versus helping the solution of violence against men?
Well, I think the problem does not come from sports or even from men or from women. It comes from the masculinity and femininity models that we push individuals to adopt and enact. And you were mentioning, for instance, Powerful Steve, you were mentioning that some women were taking up those sports as well. So the problem is not so much, whether it is a man or a woman doing those sports, if those sports are violent and are producing violence, right? It's the types of models of gendered models, role models, which are performed through those sports. And that's why, for instance, I'm in peace and conflict studies, so obviously I'm more interested in for instance, in the military rules. When you look at the military rules and you have all these people advocating for saying, oh, the world is going to be peaceful if there are more female soldiers. No, it's not going to be peaceful if there are more female soldiers, because if female soldiers behave as male soldiers, it won't change anything. So the problem is not so much, if you want, the gender balance within the army. The problem is the type of behavior that is, encouraged within the armies. And so the same goes for sports. If the sport is violent, it doesn't matter, if it's a woman or a man performing it. And also, what I'm really trying to say is that the problem lies behind the fact that some people would want to do some violent sports. So the problem lies behind the models that we are trying to enact, when we are performing those sports, when we are doing those sports. So I think the issue is broader, if you want, and changing the practices is just part of the solution, and it will. We know by experience that if we forbid some sports, then some new ones will be created, perhaps even more violent. So we need to, I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I think that we really have to think about what kind of role models we are promoting through these practices.
Thank you, Elise. Andrew, can you add your opinion to this question?
Sure. And Powerful Steve, can you remind me where we started with the question? Because I kind of want to follow Elise, but I also want to tie it back to your question.
Yeah, we were talking about government involvement, if they should put subsidies and resources towards sports and so forth. And then my thought came to certain sports where like Ultimate Fighter, UFC, and David mentioned rugby and football with the head and neck injuries and so forth. So could those sports create more of a problem as violence towards men versus be a solution?
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that, and I think I am going to echo Elise here a lot. I don't I think when we focus on those sports as either, solution to the problem or exacerbating the problem, we're really not addressing the underlying problem, which is why are people violent in the first place? We know that there are lots of folks who are able to limit their violence to the context of sport or some other place, the context of video games, and there are also lots of folks who are excellent athletes or excellent video gamers who aren't able to limit their violence to the context. And I think it's important then to go back to this question of motive. Why are people violent in contexts where they're not supposed to be? And pointing to what I think we've all said about how complex this is and how the solutions need to be local. And if we don't really understand the whys of violence, and then I think we miss the problem. And I'll go kind of all the way back to the beginning for me, and playing off of Elise's discussion of gender roles here. We often talk about masculinity as something that boys and men need to prove, at least here in the US, but we know that with lots of adulthood rights, again, boys need to prove that they are adult, that they are masculine enough, and they don't stay juvenile. At least in the US, but I believe in lots of countries, violence is a viable way to prove that you are man enough, to prove that you can protect, to maybe prove that you can provide, to use some of Gilmore's framework there. And I think as long as that violence provides a viable method of demonstrating means of provision or protection or gaining access to partners that allow you to procreate or at least have sex, then it's not going anywhere. And I think if we can focus more on those ultimate goals than the violence itself, the mechanism of getting there, then we might be able to reduce violence.
Okay, thank you very much for that. The fifth question, I got to move on here. I wanted to ask this question from the perspective of each of the panel from where you're at, because maybe Juho might not be able to home in on it. So I'm going to ask the question from the perspective of is your government effectively dealing with violence against men and boys? From your opinion, let me start with David first on this one. The question really is the United States effectively? But I want you to answer the question pertaining to where you're from. So we got the person from South Africa, we got from Finland, et cetera, et cetera. So let me ask you, Andrew, is the United States effectively dealing with violence against men and boys?
I don't think so, no. We have a Violence Against Women Act that has been federal law and at most levels state laws for over 40 years now. We don't have comparable legislation or programming or committees or whatever at either the state or the national level. State is regional here. We rarely have those at the local level, the municipal level. And again, in the US, we tend to treat violence against men as just violence, as though it has no gender. And we separate out violence against women, but we don't really talk about violence against men. So I think the US, we're really not dealing with violence against men and boys.
Okay, thank you very much. Juho, what would you say about your nation, the government? Is it dealing effectively with violence against men and boys?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's quite interesting. So our current government, it's internationally known because of its like progressive agenda, and it consists of 5 political parties, and I think all the party leaders, they are women. So that's also like people think that's a sign that they are like progressive when it comes to gender equality. But for some reason, even though we have this, like I mentioned earlier, Finland does this crime victim surveys each year. And interestingly, year after year, these surveys are saying that there is no no significant difference between the violence that is experienced by men and women. So the rates for experiencing violence, they are quite similar. But for some reason, our current government, in its governmental plan for the next years, it only decided to include and to like draft and this action plan for the elimination of violence against women. So I think that's interesting. I'm not sure why, because there is no, I don't think there is any statistics that would justify this kind of prioritization of women as victims of violence. So I think this kind of prioritization itself is problematic, and in that sense, my government, Finland, is not doing enough for this issue.
Thank you very much for that. And let's go to your female counterpart, Dr. Elise. You're also from that region. So pro or against, would you agree with Juho or disagree, and why?
Yes, I broadly agree with the fact that, and also it follows what Andrew said earlier, that when violence against men is violence, and then there is violence against women, and that usually when there are targeted programs against violence, it's against violence against women. But I think there are complicated reasons. It's not just, I saw in the comments that it's about, feminist governments and, feminist ideology. I think it's also related to the fact that it took a very long time for violence against women to be acknowledged, and to recognize the extent of domestic violence against women, for instance. And so many are scared, and there is a lot of pressure on the part of women's groups, for instance, that if we start recognizing, and I myself, for instance, working on violence against men, I've been victim of those accusations, that by shedding light on violence against men, I would somehow divert attention from the plight of women. And I think we are definitely, I think, at a very important juncture in that sense, that there is we are an important moment in time when we have to regain a certain balance, but it's complicated because we don't want to lose the gains. I think personally, I think that violence against anyone is problematic, regardless of their gender, etc., etc. And so we need to make sure that nobody is disadvantaged because of their gender, that nobody is neglected because of their gender. And this is something that is very difficult to accomplish, and it's also not necessarily very politically correct these days to actually speak about violence against men, and it's still a struggle. And I think this is a battle that I welcome those discussions. I think that you're having, and I think the work done by Sivam and his organization is a great work in that sense. But this is just very complicated, because we can't, on the other hand, say, okay, we speak about violence against men, but then it means that we won't speak against violence against women. We won't speak about violence against women anymore. So we have to keep a balance, and I think this is a balance that is difficult to keep.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much for that. Let's go down to Cape Town, South Africa. Professor David, what about your nation? How do you feel that it's dealing with this issue?
Well, I don't think they're dealing with it well. I would be surprised if there's any country on the face of the earth that is dealing with this appropriately. So I suspect you're going to get, I suspected that you would get the same answer roughly from all the panelists. And I think if you asked about many other countries, you'd get the same answer as well. I think to respond to what Elisa suggested, there is a way of dealing with this problem of violence. And as she implied, it's to oppose violence as opposed to opposing violence against men and women, or men or women. The point is that the gender is not relevant. I would argue that other things are also not relevant, like species. If people are being violent against animals, that's also not appropriate. And I think if we have that broader, simpler, better message that violence is inappropriate, of course, there are places for violence. Sometimes you may have to kill somebody in self-defense because they're trying to kill you. but that's a very limited set of cases. Ordinarily, as a plan of action and as a mode of being, violence is something to be opposed. I think it's a simple message and a better message, and it would be a more honest message as well. When people are opposed only to violence against women, or they're opposed only to violence against men, there's a certain element of dishonesty in their agenda, in what they're saying there.
You have your hand up there, Elise. Did you want to do a rebuttal? Oh.
No, I was applauding. Being a vegan myself, I certainly am against all forms of violence and across species. So I really completely agree on this.
Okay, same likewise. Andrew, you're just applauding?
Yes, and I'll echo the points that David and Elise were both making in various ways. We tend to present this, or at least the politics tend to become an either or. Either you can work for violence to reduce violence against women, or you can work to reduce violence against men. But that's really a false choice, a false dichotomy. We can work to end violence, period, as David phrased it.
I like that approach. I think that's a very good perspective. We said that, there had to be movements when it came to equality because the spectrum was so wide, when it came to women, weren't allowed to vote and et cetera. And the perception of women, they could only be in the house and cooking and cleaning and looking after children. And then the pendulum swings where everything is focused on that. And as you said, to bring it a broad scope where you said, look at, there is violence, whether it be towards an animal, whether it be towards a female, whether it be towards a male, there is violence. And let's focus on that. We come to the last question, and I would ask the founder, Sivam, I'm not too sure because I haven't been following the chat, if there's any questions that were instigated there, if he could take note of that, because after this question, the panel, we're going to go to the audience to ask some questions, and I'm not too sure if any of things that were said already was questions that were prepared. So if Sivan, you could just check that we can get to those questions first, if anybody did type a question. This question here, the final one, is very broad, but has peace activism in the 21st century been effective in reducing or curbing violence against male? And if you think it has not, what more can be done? Let me just add that on. So has peace activism in the 21st century been effective in reducing or curbing violence against males? And I'm going to start with the first person in which I started with, from Finland, Juho.
Thank you. So my title here in this discussion was peace activist, and it's because I'm a board member of Finnish peace organization called the Committee of 100 in Finland, and so I have a few years of experience of like this peace activist scene in Finland. So I would say that the answer is yes and no. So while peace activism has had an important role to bring gender equality, for example, to the military, and we are demanding that in Finland as well, to end this male conscription. And there are also issues because, of course, like peace activism, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So the discourses that are around us in society at large, they of course affect peace activists too, and so I like to call this a conservative gender discourse, what we were talking about before, where violence against men is seen as normal, and violence against women is seen as gender violence. So this discourse is within peace activism as well, and I think I would say that a lot of this has to do with, for example, the Orange Days campaign that the UN Women is doing. That's I think that's quite an authoritative discourse in the peace activist circles, and same goes for Amnesty International. If we want to count Amnesty as a peace activism, we can debate on that. But also, like, Amnesty only is campaigning for to end violence against women, and I think these discourses, like, we are the circles, they are quite small. Like the activists know each other. We know activists from Amnesty and from UN Women, and when they have such a strong discourse around this connection between gender and violence, it makes it harder to criticize it. So so I think that's changing the discourse that will be needed to be more effective. And I think for peace activism in general, like highlighting the role of gender in violence experienced by men, that would be like the next logical step to take, considering how popular the issue of gender is now. I think that would be the right direction to go, and also from a strategic point of view, we should expand this gender discourse to be more effective.
Thank you very much. Andrew?
I will admit that I don't know a whole lot about peace activism, so I'm not entirely sure how to answer this question.
Well, you don't have to.
Then I'm going to take you up on that, Steve. I think I'm just going to pass on this question and not speak from a place of ignorance.
Yes, because you're on the panel, don't feel that you have to answer all the questions, even for the sake of time. I'm seeing right now that it's 11:26, and I'm excited to hear some questions coming from the guests. Elise, do you have anything that you want to add on peace activism?
Yeah, I think certainly peace activism has done good in the sense of fighting against violence in general. So on the whole, it is also, since we know that, you know, men are the first victims of violence, then of course, then it has had an impact. But I mean, not so much in terms of awareness. And I think this is perhaps something that should be done in the future. For instance, I mean, as a professor in peace and conflict studies, I mean, it very often happens to me that I have students, when I speak about violence against men during conflicts, for instance, that they would tell me, oh yes, but women are the first victims of war and conflicts, because this is what they read in manuals. And then, you know, I have to tell them, well, that's not true. Around 90% of the victims in conflicts are men. Around a third of all victims of sexual violence during conflicts are men, and so on and so forth, just to show them that it's not that simple. So I think that perhaps the first step would be to raise awareness around these figures, also around special, you know, very basic issues like conscription, for instance. Why on earth would only men, you know, go through conscription? You know, either we agree with the system of conscription and then it's for everyone, or we disagree and then it's for nobody. You know, neither men nor women. So I think there is a bit of work to be done, and that would be the next step, I think, on raising awareness on the figures. But I'm a bit pessimistic regarding these days, because what I see is that a series of ideologies which are based on violent or at least aggressive models of masculinity are very popular. I'm thinking here about populism, radical right-wing populism, for instance. I'm thinking about nationalisms everywhere around the world. And we know by experience that all these ideologies are conducive to violence between men, among men, and against men, to go back to the distinction that David mentioned earlier. So I think that it's not an easy struggle. We know it's a lot of work to actually promote awareness on these issues, because there is a backlash, so to say.
Mm-hmm. Professor David, what is your input on the 21st century if peace activism has reduced or curved?
I think I'm going to pass on this question as well, so that we can get straight to the discussion from other people.
Okay, wonderful. And I just wanted to home in my perspective on this particular point. Me being a pastor, a Christian pastor in the city of Brampton, this being an issue where I feel everybody, each person on this panel, if you are against war from that perspective, the opposite of that being peace, therefore, each and every one of us should be a peace officer. And so if you see yourself as a peace officer, then you ask yourself, how can I, among my friends, among my peers, foster peace? And when you really look at it from that micro perspective, we can all reduce if we play our part. If we say, I have responsibility to foster peace, and you do your part, can you imagine the effect that we can have globally from that perspective? I teach a lot on forgiveness, and that's very important when it comes to talking about peace. You got to go through the process of forgiveness. So I just wanted to add that. So I'm going to turn now to Savam to ask him, do you have any questions that's already been written? And if you could help me out with that area there. The first question to the panelists.
Well, I have only one question so far. Everything else is comments, actually.
Okay, go ahead.
From Rajiv, why would the government need to fund it, though? That's a very simple, straightforward question, though.
The question is, why would the government need to fund it?
Yeah.
Okay, so we go to when we were talking about, the government seeing the importance of, I imagine they were talking about sports. That's what this. So okay, let's go to Juho. Why should the government fund extracurricular activities?
Well, as we talked earlier, that would be one way to reduce the problems that come from having like poor socioeconomical background. So that would be one way to make sure that boys, they will be able to do something during their spare time, and that would of course like reduce things such as gang violence, which also have a cost. We need to remember that.
Right. And Dr. Elise, why?
Well, I would just follow up on what Juho said. I mean, we forget that prevention of violence is a lot less costly than management of violence and reconstruction after violence. This is something that is valid both for interpersonal violence and for collective violence. And we tend to think about why would we spend money on this? And when actually we have to spend money on the consequence of that violence when it happens. So even if only a small percentage of these programs would actually work, it would still be more cost effective than not doing anything at all.
Wonderful point. So it's more it is an investment, because when you talk about preventative measures, it's about investment. So wonderful point. Thank you very much. David, what do you say to the question of why should the government fund extracurricular activities?
I think I won't add anything. I'm not sure whether we all need to respond to each of those questions. So perhaps I'll just leave it there. I don't have anything special to say.
Okay. Andrew, do you have anything to add?
I will add one additional component, but I want to highlight Elise's comment that this is really prevention funding, and that funding prevention is much cheaper than funding the consequences, violence management. For boys, one of the benefits of extracurricular programming is often a sense of affiliation or belonging, because they become part of an organization, perhaps part of a team if we're talking about sports or whatever. And again, looking at the research on what boys get out of being part of a violent gang or even just hooliganism, as it's sometimes called in the UK, part of it is that sense of belonging. And if they're not getting that from home or from their school setting, again, if we can facilitate it in ways that are likely to be more healthy than more destructive, that is worth the prevention dollars.
Okay, and thank you very much for that. I'm looking at the time, and I'm really excited to hear from our special guest. Forgive me once again. I just want to say Dan, because I really don't like botching people's last names. Dan from Kenya, and he is a real life living example of a domestic violence against men. And so we want to welcome Dan to share his story with us. Dan?
Hello, Dan.
Okay. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion.
Yes, Dan, before you start, sorry to interrupt, Dan. Can you just share with us your last name? I just didn't want to make an attempt, but can you give me?
Okay. My name is Dan Matakaya.
Matakaya.
Yes, Matakaya from Nairobi, Kenya.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm a police officer and a survivor of domestic violence. I'm also visually impaired, and I get this disability as a result of violence, whereby I was attacked by my ex-wife. And this happened on 21st September 2013 at around 5:30 a.m. in the morning. I went to the house. I was on duty. I was on night shift. I was on duty. So I went to the house at around 5:30 in the morning. And I was so tired. Being a Friday, I was so tired. And immediately I reached the house. My ex-wife was in the house and she was sleeping. So I was so tired, I just went direct to the bed. And a few minutes later, as I was sleeping, she woke up and poured sulfuric acid on my face and ran away. I started feeling the burning sensation. It was so severe. And at that time, I was unable to see because of the effect of the acid. So I woke up to try and get some water to dissolve the burns. And when I stepped on the floor, when I came out of the out of the bed and stepped on the floor, I felt a shock. She had even gone further and connected electricity and poured some water on the floor. So when I stepped on the floor, I felt a shock. She wanted me to be electrocuted in the house, but lucky enough, during that confusion, I screamed and my colleagues came for my rescue. I was rushed to the hospital, whereby I was treated, and for many times I've been in the hospital. I've received a lot of treatment. I've gone through more than 15 surgeries here in Nairobi and in US, but through the reconstructive surgeries and the treatment, but unfortunately my sight was so severely damaged, so it was not, the doctors were not able to restore my sight. But having gone through the same, I've realized that many men across the world, not only in Kenya, but across the world, face the same thing. Culturally here in Kenya, men have been groomed, whereby we have been groomed that men should not cry. we are not supposed to show our emotions. It's like we are not human beings, because human beings have emotions, and sometimes we need to cry as one way of showing our emotions. But culturally, in Africa, we have been groomed that men should not show their emotions. We need to suffer. We need to show. We don't need to show the world that we are suffering. So many of us go on suffering in silence. Others commit suicide, whereby they are unable to hold or to handle their situations, their problems. I have gone through through the surgeries, and while I was in the hospital, I came across many patients, some of whom were survivors of gender-based violence. Some of them didn't make it. Some of them gave up on the way during their treatments, refused to take their treatment, and even committed suicide while in the hospitals. But the few of us tried, and through the support of our family and few friends, managed to come out of the hospitals alive. But having gone through that trauma, I realized that many men are facing problems. Not only here, but it's a global thing. Many men across the world are going through violence. But now the society has labeled men as perpetrators of domestic violence, whereby the same society has not even accepted men as victims of gender-based violence. So whenever a man comes out and cry and share the problems he's facing, maybe in relationship or in marriage, no one is ready to listen to this individual. No one is ready to take care of the emotions that this individual is having, and to try and come up with a solution to some of these issues. You know, the society and globally, we have inclined to saying that whenever we talk about gender-based violence, is all we concentrate on women and children, but we are not taking care of men who are also victims of gender-based violence. I've gone through the same, and at that time, I realized that we have a gap in our society, whereby we have a gap. No one is talking about men and what men are going through in relationship and in marriage. So I took it upon myself, being a survivor, having gone through the pain and the trauma that I went through, and all the surgeries that I have gone through. And I realized that I'm in a better position to handle and to come up with a solution to the same issue that men in our society, locally and globally, are facing. So at that point, I decided to register an organization, because many people were reaching out to me to try and help their siblings, to try and help their children to handle the same issue, because they knew that their family members are going through the same, but they never knew how to solve the same issue because of the myth, the societal perception that we have in our society. But when I came out to share about my story, because I realized I can't keep silent when I see many people suffering, many people committing suicide, others killing their loved ones because of the pain they were going through. So I decided to register an organization. It's a non-profit called the Anshisha Foundation to try and to try and fill the gap that we have in our society, to try and come up with the solution to what many men are going through in our society. And even before I registered the organization, many families were reaching out to me to try and solve the same problem within their family setups. So I did so to reach out to create a wider platform, to reach out to a wide population within our society to solve the same problem that many people are facing. And I can tell you within the last 6 months, we have been able to help over 8,000 people within our society who are facing the same problem, whereby they are being abused by their loved ones, by their wives, by their girlfriends, but they don't have anywhere to run to. So indeed, as we talk about the issue of violence against men, it's a reality, it's happening. I usually say that the scars on my face and on my body represents my visible scars, represents many invisible scars that many people, scars of oppression, violence and abuse that many people are suffering in silence. And my voice, I truly say that speaks for many victims of the same oppression, abuse and violence that many people suffer in silence, facing the same. And I believe being a survivor, I'm in a better position to try and handle the same. And I also urge all those who are in this meeting that let's try our level best and reach out and try to solve the same thing, the same problem within our society, within our surroundings. Because many people, many of whom are our friends, our peers, that are suffering the same. But, you know, they have the best smile, they laugh the best, but behind the smile, behind the laughter, they are suffering. Let's try and reach out. Let's try and intervene so that we may have a safer society. Because globally, we have, right now, women are so fighting for women empowerment. But as we try and focus on women empowerment, we are leaving these men behind. And it's the same men we expect the same unempowered men, we are expecting them to marry the empowered women. What are we creating? We are still creating problems within our society. So let's be on front line to fight some of these gaps within even as we fight and to bring even women on the table to fill the gap. Let's not leave behind our men, because in our society, we all need this individual. Let's try and help, let's try and solve some of the problems that maybe we are anticipating. Let's not create more problems in our society, because we have been having many problems, many issues, and we have even many organizations advocating for women's rights. But for many decades, we still have a problem within our society whereby women are still abused, or there are still higher percentage of victims are women. But we need to ask ourselves, why is it that even with more resources to the organization fighting or advocating for women, why are we still having the same issues year in, year out? It's because we are leaving men behind. Let's be all inclusive. Let's include men, women, and children as we fight this vice, the gender-based violence. And let's try to come up with a solution within our society. Let's not solve a problem and at the same time create even more problems within our society. Let's think, let's reason together and come up with a proper solution to the gender-based violence. Indeed, I've suffered, and at one point I contemplated suicide, because when the doctors told me that, Dan, we are sorry, you will not be able to see again, to me, I felt that my life had come to an end. And let me tell you, you never know. Like, to me, this one patient, as I was trying to contemplate suicide, and at that time, the only option for me to accomplish that mission of committing suicide was to throw myself from the ward. I was on the 9th floor, and I tried to figure out the best way to do it, and I thought that the best way is to throw myself from that wall, the 9th floor. If I throw myself down to the ground, maybe I'll be no more. But since I was not seeing, there was something that was clicking in my mind, that what if you threw yourself from this floor, and then next to that window there's a roof, and maybe it blocks you from reaching the ground. What damage will you have caused to yourself? So as I was trying to think and figure out the best way to do it, one of the patients who was a close friend to me just told me that, Dan, I wish I could be you. I just laughed, and I thought that this guy has maybe has a mental problem, maybe he has another issue, maybe other problem facing him. And I went ahead and asked him, why are you saying so? And this guy was so honest, and he told me, Dan, you are not seeing, you have scars all over your face, but one thing I'm sure of, you'll come out of this hospital, this facility, alive. For him, he was not sure of. And it's unfortunate that we lost that guy. He had been diagnosed with leukemia, so we lost him. But to me, I can tell you that this guy was was a game changer in my life, because that statement alone changed my life. And from that time, I just went on my knees and told God that if I come out of this hospital, I'll dedicate and devote my time to helping many people who are suffering out there. And that's why I came out and registered that organization. Last year, in June 12th, we rolled out a toll-free number as the Anshisha Foundation to try and intervene on some of the problems that men are suffering, whereby we are offering psychosocial support. We are offering counseling services to those men who are facing stress, who can't handle their problem. And we just wanted to create a platform whereby men can call in and get someone to listen to them. Because many a time, these men, they are facing problems, but they don't have someone they can share their problem, someone who can listen and take care of their emotions. So that's what we did. And so far, we have helped a lot of people. We have saved a lot of life. Without resources, with volunteers, we have saved a lot of life. And I believe going forward, with the support of even this donor world, we can still reach out to many people and we can even save many lives. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Matakaya. Your story is absolutely riveting and incredible, and I can sit and listen to you for a while more, but for the sake of time, I want to thank each and every one of the panelists. And before I ask you all for a minute, 60 seconds of closing from each of you, I wanted to acknowledge Jerome Tilak Singh for imitating the movement eliminating violence against men on January the 31st, and this panel discussion as the global coordinator of International Men's Day. Thank you very much, Jerome. And so I want to just ask each and every one of the panelists if you can just try to concise your conclusions as best as you possibly can. 60 seconds, if you will. Let me start with Professor David first.
Thank you. I don't think it's easy to summarize anything in 60 minutes. So I'll just say that I've enjoyed the discussion. I want to thank my fellow panelists for their contributions. There's something in me that's sorry that we haven't had an opposing voice, because I think there's some value to be derived from interacting with people who disagree with one. Although goodness knows there are enough opportunities for that in other fora with regard to this subject. And maybe there's also a value in people who agree exploring the issue together. So thank you to everybody.
You certainly are a philosopher, no doubt. Andrew, to you next.
Thanks. I also want to thank my fellow panelists, Sivam and folks at Voice of Men 360 for facilitating this, and you, Steve, for being such a fabulous host. I guess my summative point here is that we need to pay more attention to the fact that much of the violence we see in the world is committed by men against other men. And we need to think locally when we are thinking about solutions. And again, we need to think about the motives behind why men choose to be violent instead of choosing other ways of meeting their goals, whatever those goals are.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And to you, Juho.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm kind of speechless after Mr. Matakaya's story that was touching, and I want to thank you for sharing it with us, and I want to thank all other panelists as well, and Voice of Man 360 for organizing this. I want to say that this day against violence, day for the elimination of violence against men and boys, I would say that it will be important in the future. I hope it will be observed in the coming years as well. And for that reason, I want to congratulate each of you panelists and all participants here. I think we are part of something historic, and I hope this will grow bigger in the future. Thank you.
Yes. Sivam, did we lose Elise? Is she here? I don't see.
Yes, I am.
Oh,
Absolutely.
I don't see you on my screen anymore for the photo. Go ahead, Elise. Your 60-second close.
Yes, well, like my fellow panelists, I want to thank everyone, thank them, because many of their points were really thought-provoking. So I'm really grateful for that. Also for the questions and comments. And I want to end by actually going back to one of them made by Carolina, who mentioned intersectionality and the need not to focus just on gender, but to focus on the intersection of gender and other factors, some of which we have mentioned, such as socioeconomic factors, for instance. She also mentions race in her comments. And I think that again calls for an approach which is tailored to the specific context when we want to fight against violence against men. So yeah, so that would be, I think, my main take on this. But thanks again for organizing this.
And thank you for being one of our panelists. And I'd like to go to Mr. Matakaya for his conclusion within 60 seconds.
Okay, I want to thank you for this forum, and I want to thank all the panelists for the insights and for the wonderful information they have given us. And I want to tell each and every individual that we have a role to play in our society. Ending gender-based violence against men, it needs all of us to come in and fight this vice. And it's always okay. It's okay not to be okay. I want to tell all men, it's always okay. It's okay not to be okay. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Matakaya. I want to thank once again all the panelists, the questions. Also, of course, I noticed some of you was fielding the questions that were being text as well. So I thank you very much for fielding that, even though we didn't audibly address all the questions, but in the chat room discussions, questions were asked and answered. In closing, there's a few announcements here that I wanted to share with you. That the 360 organization actually has 4 live shows weekly. One is called the Open Up. It is a live talk show that happens in every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 10 a.m. If you want to, make a note of that, write it down somewhere and support. That's what it's all about. We're all playing a part in support. There's a weekly webinar that's on Saturdays, the Sabbath for some, if you will, from 10:30 a.m. to 11 Eastern. So it's just a 30-minute webinar. The third one, it is Vilai, V-I-L-I, which is a Tamil live talk show that's on Wednesday evenings, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard, and also Sunday at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard for people who live outside of Canada. Okay, and 4, which is this setting here, which is a panel discussion that happens once a month, and we have it in English and also in Tamil. There's a podcast. The Open Up is a podcast. It's in English, and you can participate at your convenience. And the Vili, or the Vilai, in Tamil, you can participate also at your convenience. We recently started our monthly men's group. Okay, this is the 3rd Sunday of every month in the evening time Eastern from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. And even though it's a men's monthly group, but anyone can join. It's not just for men. Okay, there are no limitations with gender, age, nationality, or ethnic groups. All walks of life can participate in any of our shows. If you want to be a guest on any of the shows or willing to be part of an organization and help us directly or indirectly, please reach out to the organization. We would love to work with individuals, professionals, experts, community organizations, associations, corporations, government officials, and businesses. The phone number, I suspect Savam will put up the number here in the chat room, 437-889-8329. Once again, 437-889-8329. The email address where you could contact Voice of Men is info@voiceofmen360.org. That's info at voiceofmen 360.org. You can visit the website, which is www.voiceofmen360.org. All of the social media links are posted on the chat. Please check them out. Not only checking them out, but also supporting. And if you tell yourself right now that I'm going to send these links to 20 people, and please include your enemies as well. We always talk about our friends and associates, but you know something? You might send something out to an enemy and the enemy becomes a friend. Okay, so think of that. Tell yourself right now, write down 20 names, include who I know don't like me, and send it to them as well, because everybody can be an addition. So you have a Facebook group page, join our group so you can see our daily activities, and please invite your friends as well as your enemies. There is an Instagram link, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube. And please subscribe to the YouTube channel. And the YouTube channel is Voice of Men 360. And we want to reach out to more people and help more people. So with the commitment of everybody here playing their part, we encourage your support. And in advance, we thank you for your support. I want to thank Savam for asking me to do this. It was an honor for me to represent the organization as the host, and I learned a plethora of knowledge and information that it was hard to concise everything in 2 hours, but so much information was given. Dan Matakaya, my heart goes out to you. I'm lost for words to try to imagine the feeling of in your state of sleep to wake up to having pain coming from your eyes and your skin burning, and then trying to get to water and then to be electrocuted. My heart goes out to you, and I thank God for that person that said to you that they wish they were you, to say that you were going to walk out of the hospital, even though you will be scarred, but yet you will walk out of that hospital, and him realizing that these are his last moments, he's got nowhere to go. And so I thank you that you did not follow through on the thought of suicide. And I thank you for your strength and your courage to come and to share your horrific stories. There were some questions that I wanted to ask you, but I just said, you know what? Let me just hold my tongue and just thank you. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for establishing a foundation. And without further ado, I turn this panel and I turn everything back over to the founder, Savam. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to start with Dan, because within the last couple of days, I came to know about this story through WhatsApp group, and somehow I immediately, to connect with him or got his number, and somehow I could communicate with him, and he agreed to be part of this panel. And there's no word, but only thing is everything happening for a reason. You are here, so you already changed the life of 8,000 people, right? So if I can, or if we all together can save one life or change one mindset, we can do more. We can save more lives. That's what I want to say. And I really appreciate Steve, powerful Steve. Yes, you are powerful. And that's why we could do such an event like this. And we are hosting, and we are planning to do more of these because it's not only one time or 2 times. We had to do more. And even last night we had a couple of youth. They came out and they are really open up. They really open up, and then they shared their stories. So it's happening. So anybody, whoever is joined and being part of this panel discussion, especially today, I really want to thank Jerome, Dr. Jerome Tulak-Singh. He was the one actually initiated this idea, of course, for the movement, eliminating violence against men and boys. So that's what it is. And also, thank you, all of you guys, Andrew, Yuho, and Liz, and David, everybody, every single of you guys. Thank you. Of course, take care. Thank you. See you next time. Thanks a lot.
God bless.
Take care.